fleeing the country seemed like the future.
Communism's tight fist seized Saigon on April 30th, 1975, marking the end of the Vietnam War. In the days prior to North Vietnam's communist victory, over 140,000 Vietnamese associated with the United States and former South Vietnamese government were evacuated. However, millions more affiliated with the United States and South Vietnam were still left behind amidst the poverty, violence, and persecution. Approximately 1 million were imprisoned in re-education camps, and rumors circulated of the new regime's intent to execute all former South Vietnamese policemen and those who had served the Americans in any capacity. This prompted waves of Vietnamese to depart from Vietnam in small, unseaworthy boats, and the term boat people became the name referred to the Vietnamese refugees that fled Vietnam. The influx of Vietnamese boat people evolved into an international refugee conflict. It would also challenge countries to work together to compromise on a humane solution to prevent the flow of dangerous and risky departures.
My dad was 26, my mom was 25. That was when they decided to plan a trip and leave. You walk around and you see buildings that have been bombed, families who are not whole anymore. Everybody lost what they earned for years. It's either taken by the communists, they've lost it through the war. People weren't doing well physically, emotionally, financially, socially. The country suffered tremendously.
As multiplying waves of Vietnamese arrived at the shores of neighboring non-communist countries in a systematic fashion, the refugee camps established were overcrowded. With the spread of communism to Cambodia and Laos, the addition of Cambodian and Laotian land refugees on top of the multitudes of Vietnamese boat people aggravated the situation of refugee camps.
The living conditions in the camps were so bad that people were getting sick and malnourished. It was just a humanitarian disaster.
Indo-Chinese was the description in which all Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians were referred to, and as the years progressed, the boat people and Indo-Chinese refugee crisis were escalating. In the year of 1978 alone, there were over 150,000 Vietnamese boat people arriving at the shores of neighboring countries.
Anything is better than in Vietnam at that time. If you come to land, you landed somewhere in a refugee camp, then you know that you have a future.
Capacities of countries became stressed to the maximum, and this resulted in routine pushbacks and denial of temporary refuge. At the end of June 1979, member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, which included Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, officially announced that they had reached the limit of their endurance and decided that they would not accept further refugees. This decision had many repercussions.
People drowned. That's what the repercussion was.
They would pack hundreds of people on these boats. Lots of dangers lurks out in the sea and a lot of issues that would make it really hard to go from one place to another safely.
The vast majority of the Vietnamese boat people forced back to the turbulent waters of the ocean perished. The grave images of what the Vietnamese boat people were experiencing were quickly plastered on the news and TV screens worldwide. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees estimated the at-sea death toll to be between 200,000 and 400,000 lives. This alarmed the international community. To discuss the incremental increases in refugee deaths, the United Nations Secretary-General convened an international conference a month after the discontinuation of the first asylum in Southeast Asia. The conference took place in Geneva, Switzerland, and over 65 nations attended. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations made a compromise by allowing temporary refuge in dealing with the conflict's brunt, as long as other countries accelerated their rate of resettlement and that Vietnam promoted safe departures. Thus, the implementation of the Orderly Departure Program, or ODP, resulted. The ODP was where Vietnamese authorities agreed to permit the safe and orderly departures of individuals to resettlement countries. Vietnamese people, particularly former re-education camp detainees, could apply to legally depart from Vietnam in a safe manner. It was the first occasion in which countries of the UN were involved in efforts to prevent further exacerbations of a refugee crisis instead of dealing with its aftermath. The immediate conflict of overflowing waves of Vietnamese boat people was avoided because of the international conference and compromise decision of the ODP. The safe departures and resettlement of over 500,000 Vietnamese occurred. However, in mid-1987, things took a turn for the worse. International commitments of resettlement were waning, and first asylum countries were experiencing compassion fatigue from the resurgence of Vietnamese boat people because of the ODP losing its effectiveness. Opposition to the admittance of refugees into a country was also intense. In a New York Times poll, 62% of Americans had disapproved of Indo-Chinese refugees. Human costs at sea were also proliferating, along with piracy in Thai waters.
I have like 3 friends I know. All her family never hear anything, so that means they never make it through the ocean.
A little over 1,250 people were reported dead or missing as a result of pirate attacks in the years 1988 and 1989. It was clear that the old consensus from 1979 was no longer sufficient, and a subsequent conference took place in Geneva in June 1989. The 70 nations present at the conference developed an innovative regional approach, which was the Comprehensive Plan of Action, or CPA. The CPA was the first time in which the primary country of origin for refugees played a key role, which was cooperating and compromising with other nations. The implementation of the CPA meant that the Orderly Departure Program would be more effective by increasing opportunities for legal migration. All asylum seekers would have temporary refuge, regardless of their situation, until their status becomes determined. Refugee statuses become determined in an extensive interview with the services of an interpreter, in which a review of the refugee could be possible. The next part was the resettlement of Indo-Chinese land refugees and Vietnamese boat people to other third world countries. To cap off the Comprehensive Plan of Action, there is the repatriation of those determined not to be a refugee.
It basically designed a whole system for dealing with the Vietnamese refugees that was never been heard of before. It really was an amazing act of international cooperation for all of its failures.
By the end of 1991, over 530,000 Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian refugees were resettled as a result of the Comprehensive Plan of Action. Nearly everyone in the Southeast Asian refugee camps was resettled, with the penultimate years of the Vietnamese boat people refugee crisis tapering off to become a steady flow of Vietnamese arriving in different countries as immigrants, rather than refugees. The solutions that the international community compromised on culminated in the humane end of the refugee conflict. The resolute end of the waves of Vietnamese boat people occurred from efforts all around the world to compromise on the viable solutions of the Orderly Departure Program and Comprehensive Plan of Action. These solutions irrevocably changed the way that the world responds to conflicts concerning refugees, and paved the way for an increase in innovative responses to coincide with individual refugee situations. This is demonstrated with the new whole society approach, like the Global Compact on Refugees, that was adopted in response to the Syrian refugee crisis. The ODP and CPA allowed over 2 million Vietnamese to safely find new homes in countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia. From this mass migration are more culturally rich environments. This leaves a lasting impact in which there are millions of Vietnamese living all around the world as contributing members of society that started new lives and prospered because of the opportunities that allowed them to not only survive, but thrive.